Everyone envies Steve for having a fiancé like me, gentle, virtuous, and well-educated. Whenever that happens, he just laughs sarcastically and says, "She's bought." I stay quiet, nod gently, and continue peeling shrimp for him. Later on, his scandal with a popular actress hits the headlines. Calmly, I start packing to leave, but he grabs me suddenly. "Stay," he says through gritted teeth. For the first time ever, he lowers his head. "Name your price." I smile and say, $100 million. He nods immediately, pulling out his phone to transfer the money. But I pick up my suitcase and smile, adding, "But you can't buy me anymore." Getting married is a hassle, especially with Steve. Steve's wedding is filled with elite guests, the invitations are specially customized one by one, and the gift list needs multiple checks. And for all of this, Steve couldn't be bothered. Even choosing the wedding ring was too much for him. He just tossed a black card at me, saying, "You're on your own for this." Then Steve goes off drinking. It said a friend was bringing a new girl. Steve, used to graceful, fair-skinned southern girls, found northerners fresh. I didn't say much, just packed some hangover pills and reminded his assistant about what to watch for. Thought everything was settled until a call woke me up at midnight. "Daisy, Steve's drunk and calling for you." It's already 3 a.m., and I have to go for a dress fitting at 6:30 a.m. But I force myself up, covering my sleep-deprived dark circles with concealer. The driver takes me to the club, and as I get out, I catch a glimpse of his disdainful look. I know how they talk about me. An educated, high-achieving woman throwing herself at a flamboyant playboy out of deep love, painfully humble. Years of education all went to waste. The night is freezing as I breathe out mist and step into the club room. Steve is incredibly drunk, lounging on a dark blue velvet sofa, his shirt collar undone, exposing his elegant collarbones and a thin silver chain. His eyes are half open, hazy with alcohol. 2 girls in miniskirts lay sprawled across his lap. It's a hedonistic scene. I gently move the girls aside, using a white napkin to cover their skirts modestly, then sit next to Steve. "Steve, it's time to go home." One of Steve's friends, still somewhat sober, teases, "Steve, your lady wants you home." I heard she's a master in history, perfect at both socializing and homemaking. "If my dad knows you scored such a great fiancé, he'll scold me for sure." Steve leans heavily on me, lazily looking up with a drunken smile. "Jealous?" He gestures at me, "Bought her. You want one? Just get yourself one." The room falls silent as all eyes turn to me. I lower my gaze, quietly peeling a shrimp to feed Steve. "Yeah," I softly agree, "he's telling the truth." The ordered ring arrives. The diamond shines, the rose gold band engraved with mine and Steve's initials. I stare at the ring for a long time, glancing at the card in the box with its elegant script, "Forever Happiness." I chuckle softly, tossing the card into the trash. I've never been happy, let alone forever. That's when my phone rings. An anonymous text sends an address. It's a hotel room number. Frowning, I quickly drive over, realizing what might be happening. Things unfold faster than I expected. Just minutes later, a trending topic goes viral. Heir cheats before wedding, rumored star as a mistress. Steve and Christina get cornered by paparazzi at the Bulgari Hotel. Shutters click wildly, flashlights blinding. "Steve, is it true you and Ms. Christina grew up together, only breaking up for her career? Is this an old flame rekindled? Aren't you getting married soon? Everyone thinks you and Christina are perfect, but how do you justify this to your bride?" Steve scowls, reaching to knock the camera away, but suddenly stops. Through the crowd, he sees me. His expression shifts, showing a flicker of panic. Wearing a light dress, my hair tied loosely, the wind blowing wisps away, my makeup subtle. Next to Christina in her striking red dress, I'm probably plain by comparison. But I couldn't care less. The paparazzi follow his gaze, recognizing who I am, cameras quickly swinging my way. I walk forward as the crowd parts. Standing by Steve, I hear him murmur, "Daisy." In the next moment, I take Steve's hand, facing the reporters with a poised smile. "I'm Steve's fiancée, Daisy. Christina and Steve grew up together. Yes, Steve often mentions her. But there's a misunderstanding. Steve sees Christina as a sister. He only came to catch up with her, having confirmed with me first." Steve turns sharply to look at me. Even though I'm always gentle and accommodating, my words still surprise him. Unfazed, I keep on smiling. "Sorry to trouble you all, but since you're here, how about trying the afternoon tea here?" On me, of course. Steve looks at me for a long time before something seems to dawn on him. Under countless camera flashes, Steve smiles and pulls me closer. "Thank you, Daisy. I'm lucky to have you as my fiancé." When he leans close to my ear, he whispers, "How much did my mom pay you?" Looking into his eyes, I smile. "We're a team, Steve, no thanks needed." I got closer to Steve's ear. He thought I was gonna say a number, so he leaned in. But instead, I just smiled warmly. Then whispered something really dirty. What was supposed to be Steve's PR crisis got diffused so easily by me. But when I got home, I logged into Steve's computer. His chat history with Christina was super long. Hard to believe the usually flirty Steve would spend this much time chatting with one girl every single day. The last message was from a few days ago. "You're getting married?" That was Christina. "Yeah. You promised to wait for me, you liar." "Is she pretty?" "Prettier than me?" Steve, reply. "Do you still love me?" Christina sent loads of messages. Steve replied after a while, "After all these years, you should know." Through the screen, I felt like I could see Christina finally smiling as if she had won. But she wasn't done yet. "What about your fiancée? Do you love her?" This time, Steve replied fast. I stared at that message forever. Just one word. No. Not even a bit. Not at all. Steve came home, pretty drunk. I could smell the alcohol mixed with that Paris perfume that wasn't mine. It had to be Christina's. "Steve, we need to talk." Steve threw himself on the couch, rubbing his eyes. "Can it wait till tomorrow?" "Nope." I smiled gently. "I'm leaving tomorrow." Steve froze. It was like he had to work hard to understand my simple words. "What do you mean by leaving?" I took off my ring and placed it softly on the coffee table. "Don't you get it?" I said with a calm smile. "The contract's over. I'm off the clock. Steve, goodbye." Then I headed to my packed bags. Suddenly, footsteps approached, and Steve grabbed my wrist tightly. I turned back to face his dark eyes. Those eyes that always had a teasing glint now looked terrifyingly cold. "Daisy, what do you mean?" He gritted through his teeth. I sighed. He probably couldn't grasp it. For the past 2 years, no matter how bad things got with other girls, I'd always been patient and easygoing. He must have thought as long as he wanted to, I'd always wait. I pulled my hand away, my smile icy calm. "Steve, you know I was hired by your mom to be your wife. I've asked to terminate the contract, and she agreed. Breaking up sounds odd, so let's just put it this way. I am ending our relationship unilaterally. From now on, we won't see each other again." I reached for my luggage. There was a short silence. Then Steve's voice came from behind. "Is this because of Christina?" I paused with my luggage. "I can explain about her." "No need." I cut him off calmly while holding the suitcase handle. "No need to explain, I don't care." Steve froze. I lifted the suitcase and walked towards the door. But at the entryway, Steve blocked me. He looked down at me, the hallway light shattering in his eyes. Maybe I imagined it, but his eyes seemed teary. "I get it. So it's about not having enough money?" He gave a forced, casual smile, trying to keep his tone icy steady. Daisy, name your price. Whatever you want. I stayed silent before slowly replying, 100 million. Such an outrageous number. But it seemed to relax Steve a bit. So it really is just about money for you. He went back to his usual teasing, cynical self, pulling out his phone. I studied him quietly, smiling as I finished his thought, 100 million wouldn't be enough. It was like a knife had stabbed Steve in the back of the neck. He froze from head to toe. I walked out of Steve's house with my suitcase. The night was chilling, making me shiver a bit. Wait. Steve rushed after me. Daisy, if you're gonna leave, give back everything I gave you. He gritted with a slight sense of victory in his expression. To Steve, I entered his life for money, so giving back the nearly $1 million worth of stuff he'd given me should be like cutting off an arm for money loving me. But I just chuckled lightly. Everything's in the bedroom, jewelry, clothes, shoes, even shoes, and most of it's still wrapped. And if there's anything else, I unbuttoned my coat, pulled off the Chanel jacket, and tossed it back to Steve. Steve seemed to realize what I was doing, and his eyes widened instantly. That's not what I meant. Too late. I kicked off my heels, bare feet on the cold ground. Then the shirt, the long skirt, until I was just in a thin slip dress. The night wind blew, and I was shivering, but I wore a relieved smile. Steve, we're finally even. I picked up my tiny suitcase. Inside were just a few clothes, some books, and toiletries. 3 years ago, I walked into Steve's home with this little suitcase. Today, I'm leaving with it, taking nothing else. I rented a little studio near the school. At 8 a.m. sharp, I showed up at school. The students greeted me, "Morning, Miss Daisy." That's my job, a history teacher at a private prep school. I smiled back at them when I heard the students greeting someone behind me, "Good morning, Principal." My back suddenly stiffened. I turned around, and there was the principal standing behind me. She wore an elegant dark gray suit, and a few strands of silver peeked through her big curls. She had two identities. One was the principal of this school, my mentor who admired me the most. The other was Steve's mom. "Morning, Ms. Daisy," she said casually. "If you're free later, come by my office for some coffee." Holding the warm Americano in my hand, my back started to feel clammy with sweat. Steve's mom sat behind her desk, fiddling with the jade ring on her finger. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "Daisy, you know, I really do like you. I also always believed that my son liked you." 3 years ago, in this very office, Steve's mom asked me if I could become her daughter-in-law. Back then, Steve had just broken things off with Bella and was a mess, yet there were still countless girls eager to marry into Steve's family. I asked Steve's mom why she chose me. Back then, she lit a lady's cigarette and said through the light smoke, "I know my son. He sees you differently than other girls." Fast forward 3 years, I calmly said to Steve's mom, "Principal, your judgment was wrong. Steve doesn't see me any differently." Our connection wasn't even worth mentioning. In high school, we were classmates. He was the rich kid whose parents paid his way in, and I was the scholarship student who always topped the exams. Back then, Steve would pull out a $100 bill from his wallet and toss it at me. And I'd quietly compromise, helping him skip school, copy homework, even cheat on tests. I never felt he saw me as different from any other girl. If there was a difference, maybe it was that I had fewer scruples when it came to money. Just like 3 years ago, I accepted money from Steve's mom to become his fiancé. When I first met Steve, he greeted me with a cold smile. "Daisy, you worked so hard in school just to sell yourself like this?" He thought this kind of insult would make me back off. Instead, I accepted it all and smiled back. "Steve, you don't get it. If I hadn't worked so hard, I wouldn't even have the chance to sell myself." After finishing the coffee, Steve's mom sighed 3 times. In the end, she told me, "I can separate work from personal matters. I won't make things hard for you at work. But about the wedding, I hope you'll reconsider." I was silent for a long time and just said, "Thank you, Principal." I didn't mention Steve at all. Walking out of the principal's office, I suddenly felt an empty stomach, like I was getting low blood sugar. So I headed to the noodle shop at the school gate, planning to grab something to eat. As the chicken soup noodles arrived, filling the air with their aroma, I was about to reach for the chopsticks when a flamboyant figure suddenly appeared in front of me. Before I could react, she grabbed the bowl of noodles and splashed the whole thing at me. In a split second, I sidestepped, and the hot soup hit the ground, some oil splattering on my white shirt dress. I looked up and met a pair of furious eyes. "Bella went to tattle to his mom?" she sneered. I paused, realizing she meant my private visit to Steve's mom's office. "Gonna use his mom to force Steve to marry you, is that it?" she sneered. "Daisy, look in the mirror. What makes you think you deserve Steve? His love for me has never changed. As a kid, I thought studying hard would distance me from ignorant people like her. Experience has proven that's impossible. Life is an endless process of dealing with ignorant people, as long as you're alive." Looking Bella straight in the eyes, I smiled and said a vulgar word. Bella was stunned, then screamed, "Daisy, with that attitude, you're still a teacher? Bella, if you're the kind of talent the arts world values, me being a teacher is nothing." I adjusted my gold-rimmed glasses, smiling courteously. I regretted the spilled noodles and planned to buy some dumplings instead. Bella suddenly grabbed me, her long manicured nails digging into my skin. "What did you say to Steve?" She gritted her teeth. Why did he suddenly say he won't see me anymore? I really wanted to shake Bella's hand off and smack her. But Bella had a strong grip, and as my low blood sugar symptoms worsened, my head grew dizzier after a few attempts to break free. Just as I was about to faint, a hand reached from behind me and pried Bella's fingers off. Bella was about to yell, but seeing who it was, she froze. "Steve." Bella suddenly let go of me, but I fell backward. I landed in a warm, broad embrace smelling like Darjeeling tea. Bella's voice shrieked in my ears, "I didn't do anything to her, Steve, you." Right before blacking out, I had only one thought. I really want some chicken soup noodles and soup dumplings. I woke up to the scent of dumplings. Opening my eyes, there was indeed a takeaway box of soup dumplings on the bedside table. I immediately grabbed one with my hands and popped it into my mouth, the heat making me gasp. After enjoying the savory soup, I noticed someone sitting by the bed. It was Steve. He was wearing a white shirt today, the vibrant color in his eyes muted, faintly resembling the rebellious yet inexplicably clear-eyed teenager from high school. But I just felt tired. "I gave everything back to you," I said. "What are you here for?" Steve stayed silent for a moment. "Because of you, there's been a serious rift between me and my mom. The cancelled engagement made headlines, and now my family's dealing with a massive PR crisis. Usually, any problem related to Steve was something I'd handle. I'd protect his interests and meet his demands, swallowing all my bitterness, exhaustion, and grievances without ever uttering a complaint. But this time, I just raised an eyebrow and politely asked, "So, what's that got to do with me?" Maybe Steve wasn't used to hearing me speak like that because he was completely taken aback. These issues were no longer my responsibility. I grabbed my coat and walked out. Steve looked stunned, sparks of emotion flickering in his eyes. He's a privileged guy, used to people always catering to him, nobody ever challenged him before. I figured he wouldn't bother me again. As I was leaving the room, I heard a low thud behind me. "Daisy." This was the first time in Steve's life he had to back down. The room's quiet air felt long and suffocating. After what seemed like forever, just as I was about to leave, Steve spoke up, his voice tinged with desperation. "Those are just excuses. I admit, I wanted to see you. I miss you." I turned around, meeting his eyes, which were red and fixed intently on me. But before the second of eye contact passed, the door swung open with no courtesy at all. Bella stormed in and stood in front of Steve. "Steve, do you really think this woman ever loved you?" She pointed at me with one hand and tossed a stack of photos in front of Steve with the other. "All these years, you thought she needed money for what? She was using your money to support some guy on the side." The photos scattered on the floor, each showing nearly the same scene. A young man in a hospital gown lay in bed with a nasal tube, while I held his hand, my eyes full of affection and reluctance to let go. Steve's eyes scanned the photos, one by one. Moments later, he looked up at me. The tears in his eyes had disappeared, replaced by a dark, menacing glare. I saw the embers of hatred flickering in his eyes. I didn't know what he had to hate me for. He never loved me. In 3 years, the closest we got was holding hands in front of others, just for show. But it was like Steve had lost his mind. Friday night, I was about to head out for a run, something I always do. But as soon as I opened the door, there was someone huddled outside, reeking of alcohol. Before I could close the door, Steve shoved it back open and stumbled inside. He shut the door behind him and looked at me with eyes like black holes, ready to swallow me whole. I reached for my phone. "Steve, I can call the cops for this." The next second, Steve lunged, pinning my wrists and slamming me against the wall. My phone slipped from my grip and crashed to the floor with a heavy thud. Then Steve kissed me. It was a desperate kiss. Even as I bit his lip, drawing blood, he didn't loosen his grip. We were like two people drowning, stealing breaths from each other, with the only outcome being to sink together. Suddenly, there was the sound of fabric tearing. Steve ripped my shirt. His breathing filled the silent room, rough, urgent, and driven by alcohol-fueled primal desire. Exhausted, I stopped struggling and closed my eyes. Tears slipped through my eyelids, and Steve's lips touched my cheek, finding the cold wetness. It was like he'd been jolted. His eyes, once unfocused, suddenly regained clarity. He stared at me, seeing the reflection of his own madness. Staring at my torn shirt, he froze for a couple of seconds before taking off his jacket and wrapping it around me. "I'm sorry." He leaned his head against my shoulder, and warm tears seeped through the fabric on my chest. It took me a while to realize that Steve was crying. "You won't forgive me, will you?" he whispered. "I'm sorry, Daisy." He collapsed on my bed, repeating those words over and over. I sighed deeply, too tired to figure out what exactly Steve was apologizing for. He had too many things to be sorry for, and it was exhausting to list them all. And this guy, even if he's got things to be sorry for, who would dare hold him accountable? Even though I wanted to call the cops, after thinking it over, I ended up laying Steve down on the bed, covering him, and stepping out to call his mother. But as I covered him and turned to leave, he grabbed my wrist, barely conscious. "Daisy, I'm sorry," he said insistently. "It's in the past," I replied casually, trying to pull my hand away. "Sorry," he murmured, "I hurt you, even though I love you." It was like a thunderbolt. I looked at Steve in shock, but he had already closed his eyes, seemingly completely unconscious. But his hand still gripped mine tightly. "Steve," I said tentatively, "who am I?" He opened his eyes, looking at me steadily. "Daisy," he softly repeated, "I love you." Steve remembered the first time he saw Daisy. She was thin, quiet, stubborn, with a delicate face and pale skin, hinting at malnutrition. At that time, rumors were swirling around campus about Steve and the school beauty, Bella, while Daisy was just someone unique among all the girls he'd known. As for what made her special, Steve couldn't quite put his finger on it. Every noon, she gets a meal at the cafeteria with a free soup on the side. But Steve and his friends never set foot in the school cafeteria. They either have their home's chef deliver a meal or head out for some Japanese or French cuisine. She studies in the library until midnight every day. She's already the top student in her grade but still works so hard. And Steve and his crew are always making wishes before exams. Bella approached, laying out one piece of information after another from the private investigator in front of Steve. The man in the hospital bed is named Felix. 3 years ago, Felix was hit by a truck and ended up in a vegetative state. The doctors said his chances of waking up were 1 in a million. But Daisy never gave up. Keeping Felix alive, with all the medical equipment and caregiving, costs nearly 300,000 yuan every month. Despite being a graduate from a top school, Daisy was already burdened with student loans and couldn't get that kind of money. Do you get it, Steve? She never loved you. She sold herself to your family just for the money. You've been wearing a fool's hat for 3 years, spending money to support a half-dead man, and you still hope she'll come back to you? Bella thought by saying all this, Steve would definitely let Daisy go. But things turned out completely different from what she imagined. Steve looked at Bella, and for the first time, she felt his eyes were dark and intimidating. The private investigator's record started a year ago. Steve quietly said, "You don't know my fiancée at all. On the contrary, you know her too well." Bella's face turned pale. She forgot she was putting on an act in front of Steve. Not long ago, she even asked if his fiancée was pretty. But in reality, she'd been looking into her for a whole year. She knew not just what she looked like, but almost her entire background. Those shady thoughts were now laid bare. But I'm not lying, she did do all those things. Bella began to cry. In the past, whenever she cried, Steve would get soft-hearted. But this time, Steve rubbed his temples with nothing but annoyance in his eyes. "Bella, it's over between us. And those things, they're between Daisy and me, none of your concern. If I find you bothering her again," Steve said heavily, "all the business investments from my family to yours will be pulled out." Steve wasn't as calm as he seemed. In fact, he felt like a fire was burning within him. Jealous to the point of madness. That man, Felix, wasn't as handsome or wealthy as himself. But Daisy loved him, and even though Felix became a vegetable, Daisy stayed by his side. Unable to quench his inner fire, Steve drowned it with bottle after bottle of liquor. When he finally came to his senses, he found himself in Daisy's rented apartment. The cold tears wetting his hot lips abruptly awakened him as to what madness he was caught up in. Daisy was right in front of him. Yet, it was the first time he felt she was so far away. How could he possibly get her back? If she didn't want money, what else could he offer her? Staring down a dead end. The proud and frivolous young master finally bowed his head, offering up a heart he wasn't sure would be cherished. "Daisy. I love you." It started to rain. Fine raindrops shrouded the entire city. When Steve woke up, he was sitting in the passenger seat. I was driving. He was shocked, a bit panicked, and asked, "Are we going to the police station?" "To the cemetery," I replied calmly. Steve's complexion turned a bit pale. "Don't worry, I'm not going to kill you and bury you here." I don't even know why I could joke at such a moment. Maybe it's because, in the past, trying to be the perfect and reserved fiancé, I've always been too tense, trapped in a beautifully restrictive shell. Now that the shell was gone, this moment was the real me. I just want to take this chance, as we were engaged for 3 years, and I've never been honest with you. Let me tell you Daisy's story. In the cemetery, Steve stood beside me. On the tombstone, a young man was captured in a photograph with a shy, gentle smile. Felix. After a long pause, Steve broke the silence. "Is he your first love?" I shook my head gently. "Felix is my brother." Steve was slightly taken aback. "We're not blood related, but he's my brother. 15 years ago, Felix's dad and my mom got together, each with a child from previous marriages, and made a new family. We had quite a happy life in the beginning, but later, when I was in middle school, my mother passed away from cancer. After that, my stepfather fell into gambling and drinking. Our once financially stable family crumbled instantly. By high school, we couldn't even afford tuition for both of us. Even if a parent loves both their children equally, my stepfather always favored his biological son. He gave what little money there was to my brother and said to me, you go work. In the middle of the night, my stepfather went gambling again, disappearing for 10 days at a time. I got used to it, packed my bag, and was ready to start working the next day. But when I woke up, there was an envelope slipped under my bedroom door. Inside was the first semester's tuition for high school and a scrawled note from Felix. He said, I was the better student, and if anyone should continue their education, it was undeniably me. So, Felix went to work in the factory in my place, and each semester, I'd have tuition and living expenses deposited into my account. But it never felt like enough. My stepfather eventually died, leaving behind a massive debt. The creditors came knocking, and Felix kept them appeased but ended up working 3 jobs to pay it off, working himself to exhaustion. I wanted to go work, but Felix wouldn't let me. He said he'd worked his butt off for years and his only wish was to see me get into college. So when Steve threw a $100 bill at me just to write him a math paper, I didn't feel the least bit insulted. Quite the opposite, he was practically my savior. Everything was starting to get better. I got into college and was guaranteed a spot in grad school. Felix proudly bragged to his coworkers about having a graduate student sister. Right before my master's graduation, Felix came to visit me on a weekend. He'd heard about a popular bubble tea spot near my school and insisted on getting in line to buy me a cup. But while crossing the street with the tea, he got hit by a truck driver who'd been driving drowsy. For the next 3 years, I thought about giving up countless times. From a rational standpoint, treatment really had no point anymore, and I knew it. But I couldn't forget Felix's last words to me. Lying in a pool of blood, his lips moved with difficulty, I want to live. He wanted to live. So I couldn't give up. I've forgotten what dignity is, what morality is. I only remembered one thing, my only family in this world, told me before he lost consciousness that he wanted to live. He was asking me to save him. So I had to save him. Steve thought I gave up because of Bella. No, that's not it. Bella was always there, and if I could endure for 3 years, why couldn't I endure a lifetime? The reason I gave up was because right after I handled the PR crisis of Bella and Steve at the Bulgari Hotel, the hospital called me. Felix was gone. Even though the doctors explained to me countless times that Felix's organ failure meant it was a miracle he'd lasted this long. But I couldn't help wondering if my brother who thought of everything for me, didn't want his sister to suffer so much anymore. So he gave up. The rain stopped. A long period of quiet. My tears fell into the dirt silently. Steve tried more than once to hug me, but backed off each time. It's all right, it's all in the past. I stood up, wiped my tears. Steve, what's between us is over now too. You've seen it, we've spent the worst 3 years of our lives on each other, let's just part ways and bury these memories. Start new lives. Steve hung his head, with a neck bent as if the pain was too much to bear. He said, Daisy, if that's your decision, I respect it. But can I ask you one last question? The sky hung low, the surroundings open. I watched Steve lift his head to look at me, a tear slid down from his eye. Did you ever love me? I looked up. It started to rain again. No, I said, Steve, really, I didn't. After saying that, I ignored his completely dimmed eyes and turned away. As if I moved slower, something would hold me back. Actually, Steve didn't remember. After high school graduation, before Steve's mom found me, we did meet once. At that time, Felix was lying in the emergency room, and the hospital was nagging me for money non-stop. I ran out the hospital door, not knowing where to go. And then, 2 thugs were pestering me. Just when they were about to pin me down, a sports car pulled up beside us, with bright headlights cutting through the long night and a tall, handsome figure stepping out of the car. It was Steve. I know this comparison is inappropriate, but at that moment, after so many years, my savior seemed to descend again. Steve chased away the thugs, handed me a stack of cash. Miss, they didn't hurt you, did they? Get a checkup. My face was hidden in the dim light, plus Steve was pretty drunk, he didn't recognize me. After tossing me the cash, he got back into the passenger seat of the car and let his friend drive him away. I stood in the darkness, the night wind carrying their conversation. Wow, heroes saving the damsel. Just one less bottle of booze, let her shed fewer tears. One less bottle for Steve, maybe the beauty will fall for him. Get off it. Quit talking about that nice girl. I used that money to pay Felix's hospital deposit. Even after I entered and left the hospital, Steve's bright smile seemed to linger in front of my eyes. In that moment, love brushed past. If you insist on asking, that's my answer. But Steve, you see. On one side of the road are dazzling, bustling bars, the wealthy squandering their money into silent drinks. On the other side is the cold reality of the city hospital, the poor's toil melting into unmarked soil. Do you think love weighs a lot? No. It's too light. Way too light. Later, Steve's mother retired, and the school got a new principal. I'm still here teaching. Life runs in a line between 2 points, a bit dull, but the years finally hint at peace. In the PR crisis involving Steve's family back then, Bella was labeled a homewrecker, her career took a huge hit, and she eventually left the industry with mental health issues. As for Steve, I never saw him again. Word is, he's doing well, taking over his family's business with the help of professional managers, becoming a kind of caretaker for the family enterprise. But no new rumors have ever surfaced about him. Many people say he's still waiting for me to return. Whenever I hear that, I subconsciously look at the stars. Once, in a dark night, I was illuminated by light. The very person who warmed me was the same person who tormented me. He meant so much in my life, yet now, though we live under the same starry sky, we will never meet again. All that's past is behind me. Now, I sincerely wish him well. Many, many years later. There's this little girl named Coco, raised by her grandma. Grandma was named Daisy, she was a history teacher. She met Grandpa, who was a language teacher, through a matchmaker. Grandpa passed away early, so Grandma raised Dad and Aunt all by herself, and then she also raised Coco. When Coco got a bit older, she loved going through Grandma's photo albums. She discovered a young man in them. He was handsome, the most dashing guy Coco had ever seen. He had striking features and a captivating aura. Coco asked, "Is this Grandpa?" Grandma would always smile and turn the page, saying, "No, just an old friend from when I was young." Later, in Coco's junior year of college, Grandma passed away. At the funeral, everyone cried, but there was also a sense of peace. Grandma had lived a long life and passed away in her sleep. Her life was fulfilling, and her children and grandchildren did well, so there weren't regrets. Eventually, everyone left except Coco, who wanted to linger just a bit longer with Grandma. That's when a guest in a black suit appeared. His hair was completely white. He placed a wreath in front of Grandma's picture. Suddenly, Coco recognized him. It was the chairman of Steve Group, someone she'd seen in business media. She heard he'd recently stepped down because of lung cancer. After Steve left, Coco rushed over. In the flowers, she found a ring. Decades later, he finally placed it before her once again. Just like before, she would never accept it. She had never accepted it in the past and would never do so in the future. The diamond sparkled, and on the rose gold band were 2 initials. They said, "A lifetime of happiness."